Welcome into Mock Trial Masterclass, your guide to controlling the courtroom. I'm Luke and I want you to be a mock trial master. Let's talk about how you can make that happen. As I talk about with the students on my team all the time, there is no substitute if you want to win objections for a firm command of the rules of evidence. And one of the really important ones to understand is the rule about improper character evidence. Now, it can be a little bit tricky, but I promise that once we talk about the rule a little bit, it won't seem quite so hard. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to dive into improper character evidence. We're going to talk about what it is. We might talk a little bit about what it isn't. And most importantly, we're going to make sure you have a firm grasp of the rule so you can argue it well at your next mock trial competition. Sounds good? Let's hop in. So I want you to imagine this scenario. Imagine that years ago you were a bank robber, robbing banks all the time, in and out of jail for those crimes. But since then you have been released from prison, you have turned your life around, you've gone to counseling, you met someone and got married and started a family, and you've left your previous life of being a bank robber completely behind. But one day the police knock at your door and they say, "Hey, there's been a bank robbery nearby and we think you did it." And you ask them, "Well, what makes you think I did it?" They said, "Well, someone robbed the bank and you used to do that, so it seems like a pretty good chance you did it." So you get dragged into the courtroom and you're there in your trial, and while you're on the witness stand, the government's attorneys start bringing in all this evidence about your previous bank robberies, neglecting the fact that you've turned your life around, neglecting the fact that it's been years since this happened. The jury hears all of this information, and because you robbed banks in the past, they now believe that it's more likely that you would have done this in the future, and they find you guilty. Now, do you think that that would be fair? Right? Do you think it would be fair for a jury in that situation to hear evidence about your former life as a bank robber? Probably not, right? Because you've turned your life around and it's been a while since those types of things have happened. It just doesn't seem fair for that to come in. Well, the folks who wrote the rules of evidence agree with you and me on that point, because improper character evidence is exactly the situation that I just talked about. It's when you use things someone has done in the past to make it seem more likely that they would do the same thing or something similar in the future, or in the case that you're talking about in the moment. Now, what's unfortunate is that a lot of people, professors, teachers, scholars, if you will, want to make improper character evidence out to be something a whole lot more complicated than that. But I promise it's really not as difficult as they want it to be. And the situation that we just went through is a textbook example of improper character evidence that you can take to the bank 9 times out of 10. If you don't believe me, let's break down the actual rule for improper character evidence, talk about all of the terms inside of it, and then what I think we'll start to see is that improper character evidence really is as simple as, again, using things someone did in the past to make it seem more likely, or as a lot of people would say, that they have a propensity to do the same thing in the future. So the rule for improper character evidence comes in the Federal Rules of Evidence in Rule 404A, which says this: evidence of a person's character or character trait is not admissible to prove that on a particular occasion the person acted in accordance with the character or trait. Now, when you just look at that rule on the surface, it can seem really complicated because it uses a lot of complex terms and phrases that we don't really naturally understand. So let's break down each of the most important phrases of that rule. And let's start with the first one: evidence of a person's character or character trait. Well, that one is really as simple as it sounds. It's evidence of a person's character or character trait. And here's what that means. It's talking about evidence of maybe things someone did in the past, or evidence that leads to someone being labeled with a specific character trait or label. So let's talk about the bank robbery example I used earlier. The bank robberies in the past would count as evidence of a person's character, right? It's evidence, it's things that happen, things we can talk about in a courtroom that point to someone having a certain type of character. A character trait would be if instead of taking specific, as some legal scholars might call this, extrinsic examples, which, by the way, if you're getting that far into the weeds, you're probably way too far in. It's not that confusing, I promise. But using specific examples, that's one thing. And then when we talk about a character trait, that's when we simply give a character label. That's when we simply call someone a robber, a dangerous driver, an alcoholic, right? Those are all character traits, and it's usually evidence of character, things someone did in the past that point to those character traits. So Rule 404A starts by talking about evidence of a person's character or character trait, and what it's telling us is that that's the type of evidence we're dealing with this rule. Evidence of a person's character, things they've done to point to a character or a specific character trait. The next line of Rule 404A says that stuff is not admissible. Now, you probably didn't need me to translate that for you, but if you did, the translation of is not admissible means you cannot do it. It is not allowed. However, that's not all that the rule says. There is one more phrase that's going to help us to put a bow on this rule and really understand what it's getting at and what specifically is not admissible. So if the first two parts of Rule 404A that we looked at give us the type of evidence we're talking about when we're dealing with improper character evidence, the third part that we're about to look at tells us the how. It's telling us in the first two parts what type of evidence we're dealing with, and this third part tells us how we are not allowed to use it. And as a refresher, here's what that says. Again, evidence of a person's character or character trait is not admissible to prove that on a particular occasion the person acted in accordance with the character or trait. Now again, that's yet another phrase that sounds really overwhelming, right? To prove that on a particular occasion the person acted in accordance with the character, right? It sounds like some kind of legal professor that's wearing like a monocle, glasses that are a lot nerdier than the ones I'm wearing. I like to think the ones I'm wearing are pretty cool. Okay, that's beside the point. Here's what this means. You cannot use evidence, work with me here, of a person's character or character trait. Again, we talked about what that means. That is inadmissible if the reason you're using it is to prove that later on down the road, someone, as the rule says, acted in accordance with, in other words, followed that same character trait. So, let's break it down a little bit simpler. We know what evidence of a person's character or character trait is, right? Things that happened in the past or a specific character label that we want to slap onto someone is not admissible, cannot come in if the reason it's being used is to prove that on a particular occasion, which just means, again, sometime down the road, that person did something in accordance with, to follow, if you will, that character trait. So if we take this back to the bank robbery example, the fact that you robbed banks in the past is evidence of your character. All right, so what this rule is telling us is that evidence of you robbing banks in the past is not admissible if we're using it to prove that later on down the road you acted in accordance with that character trait. What would it mean if you were acting in accordance with that character trait? If you were following that character trait down the road, that would mean you were robbing banks again. So what the rule is telling us in that situation is evidence of the fact that you robbed banks before, which is the evidence of your character or character trait, is not admissible to prove that later on you also robbed a bank. When you break it down that way, it's a whole lot simpler. And there are a lot of ways you can take that. Let's say it was a drunk driving situation. Let's say one time in the past you got arrested for a DUI, and then later on down the road you're being accused of a DUI. But unlike the first one, which we'll say you actually did, this time you did not. And so the government wants to bring in evidence and say, hey, he or she got a DUI in the past. But they can't do that. They can't use something you did in the past, again, a character or character trait evidence, to prove that down the road you acted in accordance with that character trait. You did the same thing again. You followed in the footsteps of that character trait. That's all improper character evidence is. Like I said at the beginning, and like we've seen through Rule 404A, Improper character evidence is quite simply using things someone did or sometimes things someone was in the past to make it seem more likely that they'd do the same thing or act the same way in the future. That's all it is. Now, you might be wondering, well, what if I want to use evidence of things someone did in the past for some other reason? That's a great question, and sometimes that's actually going to be allowed. Rule 404B gives some clarity on that, and we're not going to go into that in this video because for right now, I don't want you to get overwhelmed, and I just want you to be focused on understanding improper character evidence under that rule we looked at, Rule 404A. We'll get into Rule 404B some other time, but for now, just know, again, evidence of someone's character or character trait, in other words, something they did in the past or something they were in the past, is not admissible to prove that on a particular occasion, sometime down the road, they acted in accordance with that trait, or in other words, that it's more likely that they did the same thing or acted the same way again. That's all it is, and I know you can grasp that, and I know you can understand that. Now, something else I know is that the rules of evidence can be tricky because, again, improper character evidence is just one of them. You got to deal with hearsay and relevance and all types of other rules of evidence to be able to excel with objections. And that's partially the reason why I wrote my book, Mock Trial Masterclass, which you can pick up a copy of on Amazon by clicking the link in the description on YouTube or in the show notes on podcast platforms. This book has 2 whole chapters all about objections. One just about how to make objections generally, and then there's a whole chapter on the rules of evidence. It's the longest chapter in the book, and I take every rule of evidence, like improper character evidence and relevance and hearsay and all the very common ones, and we break them down just like we did in this episode. If this made sense to you and you want to see the same type of logic, the same type of making things simple apply to the other rules of evidence, then this is the book for you. But I hope that you go into your next mock trial round ready to argue improper character evidence with the best of them. And I know that if you understand the rule and couple that with good methods for making and arguing objections, you'll do just that.